and finish up chapter. Come on. All right, let's go ahead and finish up chapter 5 here. And last I checked, we had just finished up cartilage. And so we were moving on. We were in our second type of connective tissue, right? And that connective tissue was supporting connective tissue. And so we had just finished cartilage, elastic cartilage. So let's get into the second type of connective tissue, which is bone. And we're going to go into a lot more detail on cartilage and bone in chapter 7. But a couple of things that you should be aware of when we're talking about this type of connective tissue, right? Obviously, from what we already know about bone, bone is going to be a little bit more rigid, less flexible, although there is a little bit of flexibility to bone, but basically it's going to be more solid and rigid. And so there's two components to our bone. We have organic and inorganic. Now this is going to come into play later on, but you should at least get to know what it means now. Our organic components are made up of collagen, which is a protein fiber, and glycoproteins, which is our ground substance. So those two components, right, are part of that connective tissue matrix that we learned about. Right? We have cells, protein fibers, and extracellular matrix. Well, collagen and the glycoproteins are part of that extracellular matrix. And then our inorganic components, right, are the calcium salts. And that's what gives the bone its rigidity. So if you want to think of it like this, the organic components will give the bone what little flexibility it has. The inorganic components give bone its rigidity and a lot of its support. So the predominant bone type that lives in this tissue are going to be osteocytes. And they live in those little spaces there inside the bone. And we saw that with the chondrocytes and cartilage called lacuna. And so there's two types of bone, compact and spongy. So the compact bone is going to be when you're talking about a long bone, like the bone in your arm or your thigh bone, the femur. Okay, you're thinking of a long bone. Well, the outer, think of it like a pipe, like a hollow pipe. And the wall of the hollow pipe is made up of compact bone. And in that compact bone, we will see, right, tons of little canals. They call them neurovascular canals because neurons are we have nerves and we have blood vessels that travel through these canals. And they go all over the place in the compact bone. And so what we'll also notice, and we saw this in lab, we saw these cylindrical structures called osteons. And that's the structure I was telling you about that looks like a tree ring. Okay, so at the center you have this dark hole, and then we have these layers that surround it like rings of a tree that go out further and further. And those layers are called lamellae. Right, and in the center here, that's the central canal, that's where blood vessels and nerves will reside. Right, so we'll see, right, these structures all throughout our compact bone. Okay. So then we also have spongy bone. And so the spongy bone is going to be just on the interior portion of the compact bone. And so the nice thing about spongy bone is that it's incredibly lightweight, but it also is going to offer some stability and strength to our tissue. Okay. So a couple of functions of bone, obviously you could already assume this from what you know, right, through observation, but it's where, all right, the bone allows us to have movement because that's where the skeletal muscles attach to. So it allows for movement, all right. It's also going to offer support to some of the tissues that are involved, right? And then we'll also see it, especially for our skull and rib cage and whatnot, how it will protect some of the vital organs that reside inside. And then finally, okay, we also use it as a storage site for calcium and phosphorus. Phosphorus is important for energy production, for example, ATP. okay, adenosine triphosphate. Calcium is used in numerous things besides being part of the calcium salts that make up bone. We need calcium for proper nerve function, and we need it for proper muscle function, which we'll learn in chapters 10 and 12. And finally, all the cells that float around inside your blood are made here, inside of the bone. That process is called hemopoiesis. So that's the creation of red blood cells, white blood cells, and the platelets. So here's a picture, okay, of that compact bone. So you'll see here, we have our our osteons, these circular structures. At the center of our circular structure is the central canal, and that's where blood vessels and nerves are going to reside. And then we have these layers, these rings that go out from the center, and those are called lamellae. And throughout, you'll see these little dark dots here, and those are called lacuna. And those are spaces in which the osteocytes live. So the bone cells will live in these spaces, and they'll maintain the bone matrix. Again, we'll talk more about that in detail in chapter 7. Okay, so that's our bone, and that's the last of our connective, our supporting connective tissue. The last type of connective tissue is fluid connective tissue. We don't talk about it too much in this course. We'll spend more time on it in Bio 211. Okay, but there's two types: blood and lymph. Right, blood and lymph. Okay, so the blood, as you know, is going to travel throughout our cardiovascular system, right? And it is made up of fluid and formed blood elements. All right, so the fluid is going to be an overall composition of all the blood formed elements and our actual liquid, which is our plasma. So you probably heard about that. Sometimes we give blood, and sometimes folks will donate plasma. So think of the plasma as the liquid portion, and that's actually considered the ground substance. And then when we're talking about the formed elements of the blood, we're just referring to the cells. So that's going to be the erythrocytes, your red blood cells, your leukocytes, your white blood cells, and then our platelets or cellular fragments. So we know that the erythrocytes are going to transport carbon dioxide and oxygen. Where the leukocytes, those are our immune system functioning cells, right? And so they'll help us combating certain pathogens and infectious agents. And then the platelets will help us to clot blood. Now in the plasma, that's where we have a lot of stuff, right? We'll see lots of different dissolved proteins, for example, antibodies, right? Albumin, which is a protein made by the liver, right? So we'll see these dissolved right into the plasma. We'll also see some of our hormones, our water-soluble hormones, will be out there in the plasma. Right, and also cellular wastes, okay, so urea and whatnot, and then obviously nutrients like, for example, some of our lipids, also some of our like glucose, right, will be found in the plasma. Now, lymph is pretty much something that comes from the blood plasma only to return back to the blood plasma. Right, so in lymph, we won't see cellular fragments or components, none of that. Right. Basically, I tell folks lymph is essentially the drained sewage from your tissues. And so to go into the lymphatic system, circulate around and go through all the processes and areas of the lymphatic system, eventually to wind up back in the into the cardiovascular system. It gets dumped back into your bloodstream. And then it goes through, you get to learn about all that in detail later on. So here's a quick picture of our blood. And you can see, okay, you have some red blood cells here, some white blood cells, and then these little dots, those are the platelets. All right, that's it for our connective tissue. So we have both the epithelial tissue covered and the connective tissue covered. So now I'd like to talk about our third tissue, which is muscle tissue. And of course, when you think of muscle tissue, you should be thinking of movement. Okay, so these cells have a certain amount of excitability. So when they are excited or stimulated, they will contract. And that contraction will cause that movement. So we'll see, all right, when movement occurs, it can move, obviously, body parts, arms, legs, fingers, head, neck, shoulders, or it can move something else other than limbs or part of the skeleton, right? Like the heart pumping blood. So that'll move blood through the cardiovascular system and throughout the heart, or our smooth muscle, which will move certain things through other systems, right? For example, the digestive and urinary systems, moving digested food and our urine through those systems there. So there's three types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. All right, so skeletal, right, also known as voluntary or striated, and we call it striated because it has alternating light and dark areas. Its job is to move things, and it's going to move the skeleton. These cells are long, and in some cases they can be as long as the entire muscle themselves. But they have many, or what we consider to be multinucleated cells. And so the interesting thing about this muscle tissue, right, is that it is stimulated by what we call the somatic nervous system. And the somatic nervous system is the nervous system that you have conscious control over. So this muscle tissue is voluntary. It's the only type of muscle tissue that's voluntary. The other two types are involuntary. You have no conscious control over those muscles. So skeletal muscle is long cylindrical cells that are multinucleated, that do not branch, that have striations, alternating light and dark areas, and it is voluntary tissue, which means you have conscious control over it. So here's a picture. We've seen this before in lab. You can see the striations there. You can see all those different nuclei, right? And then you can also see how it's a long cylindrical cell. So where do we find this tissue? In skeletal muscles, all over the place. Okay, the second type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle tissue. All right, so the cardiac muscle tissue is going to be found in one place, in the wall of the heart. All right, there's three layers to the heart. The middle layer is what we call the myocardium. So that's where you'll find this tissue. And it has one job: to contract and pump blood through the heart and throughout the cardiovascular system. It also is striated, okay? These cells are not long and cylindrical, okay? They branch or bifurcate. So I told you folks before, it looks like a Y sitting on its side here, okay? So you'll see it branching out. So these cells can have 1 to 2 nuclei, right? And they're connected to each other, all right? Aside from cellular adhesions, all right, we have these structures called intercalated discs. I mentioned this before in lab class. These intercalated discs are made up of what we call gap junctions and desmosomes. The desmosomes, think of those as the anchors. They're going to hold the cells tight against one another. So that helps with a more forceful contraction, but a more effective contraction. And the gaps there, all right, those allow for the rapid conduction of the electrical activity of the heart, which we monitor through an EKG, for example. Again, we'll talk more about that in 211. But one of the interesting things, and I mentioned this before, this type of tissue is involuntary. Okay, so you cannot control it. Right? But the nice thing is the cells themselves in cardiac tissue have what we call pacemaker cells, which they'll initiate a contraction. So if we were to take out all the nerves away from the heart can still beat. Okay, it'll beat differently, but it can still beat because of those pacemaker cells that are going to initiate the contraction of the heart. Right? Again, it is involuntary. So it is not controlled by the somatic nervous system. Here's a picture of our cardiac tissue here. So you can see these dark lines here. Those are going to be our intercalated discs. Those are made up of the gap junctions, and they have the desmosomes there. that allow these cells to contract more effectively. Right? You can see we have 1 or 2 nuclei per cell, and you can see how it bifurcates here. And obviously it's still striated, alternating light and dark regions. All right, the last type of muscle tissue is the smooth muscle tissue, also known as visceral muscle tissue. So obviously, all right, when we call it smooth muscle tissue, it is not going to have striations. All right, so these cells look like a football. Remember, I was telling you, similar to a fibroblast, okay, be fat in the middle and they taper off on the ends there. Okay, so they'll look sort of like that. It's a bad attempt to be a good drawing here. And then we'll have our nucleus at the center there. So we'll find this throughout your blood vessels, because remember, when our blood vessels vasoconstrict, these muscle cells will contract. We'll also see it in some of our airways. Anywhere where we're moving things through the internal portions of our body. So that includes our blood vessels, all right, the digestive system throughout the small intestine, the large intestine, okay, even through the stomach, all right, our urinary bladder has smooth muscles in it. In the uterus, when it's time for the baby to be born, okay, those smooth muscle cells will start to contract and start to move the baby out of the uterus into the vagina and then out from mom, okay? Again, this type of muscle tissue is involuntary. We don't have voluntary control over this. I can't simply stop food from moving through my small or large intestine as much as I would like to. If I'm on a long car trip, I can't do that. So this is involuntary muscle tissue. So here you can see a nice picture of our smooth muscle tissue. 1 single nuclei per cell, no striations are apparent. Okay, and these cells look like they're tapered cells. So the last type of tissue, we're finally here to the end of our tissue. Okay, the last type of tissue that is present is going to be nervous tissue. We're going to find nervous tissue, all right, in our brain and spinal cord. I've mentioned this before. These 2 areas are part of the central nervous system. And then obviously the nerves that are found throughout your body. So there's 2 types of cells that are found in nervous tissue. Our neurons, and so that's going to be the cell that's going to receive, transmit, and process information or nerve impulses. And then we have the support cells, which far outnumber the neuron cells, and these are called glial cells. Important to know, they do not transmit any nerve signals, but they do everything else. Okay, they're pretty much responsible for taking care of these neurons. So they protect, they're going to nourish the neurons, and they'll also support the neurons. So when we talk about a neuron, there's a couple different parts to the neuron. We have the cell body, okay, and then we have these processes that come off the cell body, and those are called dendrites. In the cell body, that's where we'll find the nucleus and a lot of our organelles. Then you're going to have this one big process that comes off the cell body, and that's called the axon. And so these dendrites are going to receive information or transmit information, right? But what will happen is that information eventually has to move down, all right, the axon. Because at the far end of the axon, all right, where the neuron terminates, there's either going to be another neuron to transmit that information to, or an end organ, which will be a muscle or gland. So we'll see, we'll talk more about this in detail in chapter 12. So you can see here in our picture, all right, of our nervous tissue, okay, this big structure here, that's the neuron. All right, and then you can see a lot of these little darker dots. Those are going to be the glial cells, or the nuclei of the glial cells. So you'll see there's plenty of them where you only have about 2 neurons here in this slide, and you've got about 10 or 15 of the glial cells sitting all over the place. So that's what I'm talking about, that they outnumber, right? The glial cells outnumber the neurons. So you can see here, here's the cell body with the nucleus and a bunch of organelles inside. Then you have these smaller processes that come off. Those are the dendrites, but you have this big, long process, and that's the axon. So eventually the nerve signal will transmit down through here to the terminal end of the neuron, and then there'll either be another neuron over here or an end organ, a muscle or a gland. So we get to learn about how exciting all that is when we get into chapter 12. We'll be there soon. Okay, so that concludes tissues, right? Another level of organization, right, in the body. Scratch it off, mark it off the list. We are now moving on to more complex, all right, and larger level of organization, all right, which are organs. So now we're going to take a bunch of tissues and throw them together into this structure to perform these different complex functions. And so in a lot of these cases, these tissues will have to work together. So we're going to talk about some of the different organs. This is a little bit of a review, like I said, because we did it in lab. So let's talk about the stomach. Okay, the stomach has all 4 tissue types here. All right, the lining of our stomach is going to be epithelial tissue. And a lot of those epithelial tissues will have, all right, secretory functions, glandular functions to create, all right, those digestive enzymes to help break down the ingested food and liquid that you took in. And as you know, deep to epithelium, epithelium sits on a basement membrane, but on the other side of that basement membrane is going to be connective tissue. And so the connective tissue is going to have, remember, all the stuff. And so in this case, as we're talking about the stomach, all right, we're going to see a lot of loose connective tissue, all right, the areolar, because that's where our blood vessels and nerves are going to be. And we'll also have some dense irregular connective tissue in the wall of the stomach. And that's going to help to provide shape and support to the stomach. Then also in the walls of the stomach, we're going to find muscle tissue, specifically smooth muscle tissue, involuntary muscle tissue, visceral muscle tissue, is another name for smooth muscle tissue. And so think of the smooth muscle tissue as a cement mixer. It's going to churn all the food product in there in the liquid and mix it up. Helps to break it down, helps to mix in those digestive enzymes with whatever you ingested. All right, and then we'll also see nervous tissue, because we've got to have a way to control all these other tissues, and that's what nervous tissue does. It is going to help to control or regulate the glandular secretion in the epithelial tissue and the movement and contractions of the smooth muscle tissue. So if this was all a concert, think of the nervous tissue as the conductor. It's going to run the show. So here you can see all these wonderful tissues together. So the lining of the stomach, here is our epithelial tissue sitting on top of our connective tissue here. And then deep to that, we're going to have 3 layers of smooth muscle tissue that moves in all these different dimensions. And then sprinkle throughout all this, we got nervous tissue. Here's some nerve tissue, some nerve tissue down here, some more nerve tissue down here. All right, body membranes. I have talked about a couple of the membranes before in lab, but I want to conclude with all 4 body membranes. We're going to talk about 3 in more detail. The first one, the mucous membrane, we don't really talk about too much in this class. Okay, but keep in mind that the body membranes are going to be formed from epithelium. And then, of course, that epithelium sits on top of connective tissue. So we're going to see body membranes on the covering of the body, lining the body cavities. It's going to be found on organs inside. It's going to be found lining some of your joints. Okay, so there's 4 types. the mucous membrane, the serous membrane, cutaneous membrane, and synovial membrane. Our first one here is the mucous membrane, also known as the mucosa. Again, this membrane is going to be in areas that are exposed to the outside, the external environment. So the openings to your mouth and nose, so that would be the digestive and respiratory system, right, will have a mucous membrane there. Also, the exits to your body, all right, urinary, reproductive tracts, digestive tracts, okay, you're going to see, okay, that, so that's what I tell folks basically is the mucous membrane is going to be in areas that are exposed to the external environment. It plays a large role of protection. Okay, mucus is essential. We talked about it before when we were talking about the simple columnar epithelium in your digestive tract, right? The non-ciliated simple columnar epithelium. The goblet cells produce the mucin, turns it into mucus, and it's used for lubrication. Well, that lubrication has a protective function to it, right? We'll also see, right, when we talk about the secretory function, obviously, right, the mucosal membrane is going to have glandular tissue in there to produce, all right, that mucin and other secretions that are going to be present in the mucous membrane. And then we'll also see how it functions in an absorptive capacity as things are moving from the external environment into the mucous membrane. All right. So keep that in mind. And I've already talked about the mucous membrane before, but I just kind of wanted to pull it together here. The next body membrane is going to be the serous membrane. And so again, this is going to be lining the body cavities. And it's made up of that simple squamous epithelium. We also refer to it as the mesothelium. All right, so there's two layers. You got a parietal and visceral layer. The parietal layer is going to line the body cavity, the internal wall of the body cavity. And then the visceral layer is going to line the viscera, the organs there. And in between, all right, there is a space. And in that space, we have our serous fluid. All right, and that serous fluid has a function of reducing friction. So there is less likelihood of damage or injury to the tissues or the organs there. All right, the third type of body membrane is the cutaneous membrane. We're going to talk about this in chapter 6 here soon, right? But that is our skin. Okay, so this is one of the body membranes that is going to cover the external surface of our body. Now, the cutaneous membrane is made up of that keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So therefore, we should know by now that the keratinized epithelium is dead cells. And on top of underneath the epithelium, all right, again, we'll have that basement membrane, and then we'll have our connective tissue that sits underneath in the dermis there. All right, so this cutaneous membrane, we talked about all the different functions of the skin already, but partly its job is to protect the internal organs, and believe it or not, what's deep to your skin, all right, and deeper to the subcutaneous layer, skeletal muscles. Well, guess what? Skeletal muscles are considered to be organs. Right, so this cutaneous membrane is going to protect the skeletal muscles in addition to other organs that are found underneath. Right, obviously, it's going to prevent water loss. It's going to protect, acts as a selective barrier so that certain pathogens can't enter in. There's a whole list of functions for the cutaneous membrane. The last membrane is the synovial membrane. We'll talk more about this in chapter 9 when we talk about joints. But some of the joints in your body have capsules, right? And so these joints, all right, will be lined by a synovial membrane, right? And this synovial membrane is made up of loose connective tissue. And then on the inside lining there, right, we'll have a layer of squamous epithelial tissue there. And that squamous epithelial tissue is going to produce the synovial fluid. All right, and that synovial fluid will fill up that capsule, and it's going to offer nutrients to the tissues inside there. It's going to act as a shock absorber and reduce some of the compression that goes on in the joint. but it also helps to provide nutrients for the cartilage in there. Because remember, cartilage, mature cartilage, is avascular. So it has to find different ways to get nutrients. And so this is one of those ways that synovial fluid will provide nutrients to that cartilage because they don't have their own blood supply. All right, let's talk about some tissue modification. I've mentioned this before, all right, and you need to know some of these terms here. And just a quick review. I told you this is going to be a review chapter. All right, when we talk about our tissue modification, the first term there, hypertrophy, refers to an increase in size of the cells of the tissue there, okay? Hyperplasia refers to an increase in number of the cells of a tissue. Whereas atrophy, yes, is the opposite. It's a reduction, okay, but it refers to both a decrease in cell number and or size. Okay, so you have to be specific when you're talking about, like, for example, weightlifters, when they're exercising and their muscles start to get bigger and swollen, that's hypertrophy. They're just increasing the size of the muscle cells. Okay, they're not increasing the number of the muscle cells. All right, whereas with atrophy, all right, when you become bedridden, right, the number of cells or the size of the cells can decrease. And we'll see that that happens with normal aging. I told you after a certain age, after the fourth decade, you start to lose about 10% of your muscle mass. All right, or if you've ever broken your leg and you had to wear a cast for a couple months, they take the cast off and you notice that that leg has become smaller. And that's because you haven't used the tissues like you should have because it was immobilized. Which brings me to stem cells. I'm going to come back to this topic here in a moment in regards to tissue modification. But stem cells, people ask me all the time, you know, what's the deal with stem cells? All right. These cells are, it's important that you know this, they're undifferentiated cells, which means they haven't made up their mind what they're going to be, which is good because a lot of the tissues in your body don't live that long. Okay. And because of that, right, we'll see a lot of cell division occurring to replace those cells that don't live long or that get damaged. All right. So perfect example, some of the cells in your blood, okay, your red blood cells only have a life of 120 days. So they're going to be constantly leaving circulation and being replaced by new blood cells. All right. So stem cells are these cells that haven't made up their mind, they're undifferentiated. And then when they do differentiate, they can turn into several different types of cells depending on what the body requires, what that tissue needs. All right. So basically what will happen is, and we talked about it a little bit with the skin, all right, you've got these cells in the strata basale, right, that are dividing. And when one cell divides, it produces two new cells, and those are called daughter cells. And that's what happens with these stem cells. So they'll divide and produce two daughter cells. Now, one daughter cell will go on and develop into a specific cell type. It could be a white blood cell, okay? It could be an epithelial cell, all right? The other daughter cell will then remain and then divide again, okay, when it needs to. So when we have those stem cells, when one is going to divide, right, the two that result, one of those is going to specialize into some specific type of cell, where the other one is just going to hang out and divide again, and then give us two more daughter cells, and then one of those daughter cells will specialize, and the other one will just hang out for another cell division. Okay. So going back to tissue modification, right? This next term here, metaplasia, right, is when we see our mature epithelium. Important to understand, mature epithelium, right, when it changes from one type to another type. And a lot of this has to do with adaptation. And I mentioned this before about smoking. Okay, normally in the larger respiratory passageways, right? Those areas are going to be lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So essentially one single cell layer. That's going to have goblet cells and all this fun stuff. And the cell type, the epithelial cells, are going to be tall, all right, taller than they are wide. Well, after smoking for a while, those cells transition into non-keratinized stratified squamous. So we go from one single cell layer to 2 or more cell layers and to a completely different shaped cell. All right, so with metaplasia, you can see when the offending agent, whatever it is, an environmental factor or what, is no longer present, when the stimulus is no longer present, right, the tissue will revert back, right, to its normal form. We'll see it in people with GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, right? These are the people that will get that kind of stomach acid sensation going up into their esophagus. And so they'll see that the epithelium in the esophagus, all right, starts to change also. But if they treat the GERD, then it reverts back to its normal epithelial lining. All right, dysplasia. This is where, you start to see some abnormal tissue development occurring. Okay, and I talked about this when we're talking about pap smears. All right, so in some cases, this tissue could become precancerous. And if left alone, it could potentially develop into a neoplasia or a cancer, or it could revert back to normal. So in situations like this, you just have to basically keep an eye on this type of tissue here. That's why some folks, when they go in for a pap smear, they're called back and asked to come back in for another pap smear in a month, just because they wanted to check, because there was some abnormal cells on the pap smear. And that's what this is. That's that dysplasia. And then there's the big neoplasia. This is when our tissue starts to get out of control. Okay. And so you hear the term neoplasm, which is a tumor, but we start to see that abnormal tissue development occurring. Now, if it's localized and it doesn't spread, we call that benign. All right. But if it does start to spread and it starts to grow out of control, then that's what we call malignant. When a cancer has metastasized, that means it's spread out and it is invading other tissues in your body. All right. That's when we refer to our neoplasia as cancer. Right. And depending on what type of cancer, where it's located, there's lots of factors will determine, all right, how much it's going to impede or impair, all right, normal functioning of those tissues. And if it's bad enough, it can actually lead to death. I didn't talk about this in lab, but I want to talk about it here, is tissue necrosis, all right, which is tissue death. Now, this is going to occur, all right, once the tissue is dead. It's almost like those keratinocytes that undergo the keratinization process, right? Once the keratin is produced, that cell is going to be dead, right? So this is going to be an irreversible tissue damage that is going to be prevalent in this tissue. And of course, when we start to damage tissue, one of the first things we're going to see is inflammation. Believe it or not, inflammation is part of the healing process, right? But we'll start off with the inflammatory response that occurs once this tissue starts to die. So you've heard of terms like gangrene, or that flesh-eating bacteria, necrotizing fasciitis, right? So we're going to talk about a couple of these different types of necrosis here, right? So gangrene, this is where we're going to see some of the soft tissues start to die. Okay, and you'll see it in folks, especially in cold weather areas. If they get frostbite significantly, they can lose the distal portions of their fingers or toes, the tip of their nose, their ears. Right? Usually what will happen is because you get a decrease in blood flow to those areas. That's why you see it quite frequently in folks that are having issues with managing their diabetes. And for those of you that work in the healthcare profession right now, all right, and you have any diabetic patients, you know what I'm talking about. All right, because one of the unfortunate occurrences with diabetes is it over long periods of time, if it's not treated and taken care of correctly, it can cause poor blood circulation, especially in areas distal or far away from the heart. And so that's what we'll see here with our gangrene. It's really bad if we start to get obstruction of blood flow to the intestines, right? Because, right, if we're not getting blood flow to the intestines, that tissue there will die. And that can cause obstruction of other things. If the tissue dies, the smooth muscle there can die, and you can start to get the backing up of food stuff in the intestines, and that causes a whole nother host of problems. Okay, so that's why it's always good to go to the doctor and make sure that everything's moving well. A couple different types of gangrene. We have dry, wet, and gas gangrene. All right, the dry gangrene, that's the one that I was talking to you about in the extreme cold. All right, it decreases the blood flow to those areas. All right, and then what will happen is the tissue there will start to just kind of deteriorate, or what we call desiccate. Right, basically just dries up. All right, that's what desiccation means. It means to dry up. And obviously, it's like if you've ever seen movies in which they show the rapid aging of somebody, you know, it always ends up with like their body turning into sand and blowing away. Well, that's essentially what happens here. The tissues just dry up. All right, wet gangrene is a little bit different. Now we're going to be dealing with bacterial infection. All right, and so the bacterial infection there will occur in the host tissue there. All right, we no longer have blood going to that area. And so as those cells start to die, they start to release, all right, the cytoplasm and the fluid on the inside. Now, part of that, again, we don't go through it so much in this course here, right? But a lot of times when the cells start to die, you can get a buildup in the tissue of fluid, and that's what this bacteria love, all right? When that fluid now is being released from the cells, now that tissue is just engorged with that fluid there, and that allows the bacteria to hang out and really kind of flourish or thrive, reproduce, because now they have everything at their disposal, all right, to continue on with their life cycle. Gas gangrene, again, is going to involve bacteria, but now the bacteria have gotten into that dead tissue, and part of when the bacteria have invaded that tissue, part of their metabolism, all right, is going to produce waste. You know, metabolism is ingestion of nutrients and then the expulsion of wastes. Well, what will happen is, as part of the metabolism of these bacteria, right, they'll start to produce these gas bubbles in the tissue itself. And that's why we call it gas gangrene. All right, the final part of tissues, because after this chapter, we are now going to be going into systems. And for this, at the end of most of those chapters, we will be discussing, all right, the aging effects on those systems. So it's good to have a general understanding here of the aging effect on tissues in general. Now, the nice thing is, all right, with proper nutrition, healthy lifestyle, pretty decent or good normal circulation, and low incident rate of injuries, right, all of those, okay, will produce or promote normal function. Cool, all right? But as we get older, we're going to see that some of those things decrease, right? So this is what happens all the time in our bodies, okay? So our cells in our body are constantly supporting, maintaining, and replacing cells and their extracellular matrix all of the time. This is ongoing, okay? Every day, while you're sleeping, this is happening. While you're eating, this is happening. As you're sitting here, this is happening, okay? But as we get older, things slow down. So it depends on what your definition of middle age is, right? But I usually tell folks around the 4th to 5th decade of life, all right, these functions, the support, maintenance, and replacement of cells in the extracellular matrix, becomes less efficient or effective, right, after the 4th decade of life. And here's what happens, okay? Just keep in mind, slow, everything slows down. So our epithelia thins, our skin thins, okay? And that's because The cells in the stratum basale, all right, are no longer dividing at the same rate. Okay, so they have decreased. So they're no longer producing all of those cells for the epithelium or the epidermis, excuse me. And so that causes thinning of the skin. All right. Well, what else is in our skin? Protein fibers. Okay. So the connective tissue is going to lose its pliability and resiliency. All right. What does that mean? Well, what gives the skin its resiliency? Collagen. Collagen production decreases. Well, what gives skin its pliability? The elastic protein fibers. That also decreases. So both collagen and elastic fibers, all right, their production decreases. All right, so therefore the skin and the connective tissue of the skin will lose its stretchiness and its resiliency or its toughness. All right, bones become brittle. All right, do you know why? See the previous bullet point. Collagen declines. Remember what I told you. All right, there's two parts to bones, or two components, an organic component and an inorganic component. The inorganic component are the calcium salts. That's what makes bone hard. The organic component is going to be the collagen and the glycoproteins. All right, and that's going to give the bone its flexibility. All right, so as collagen declines, all right, the bones become less flexible, more hard and brittle. We'll see with our muscle and nervous tissue, those tissues start to atrophy. So the cell number decreases and the cell size decreases. And then if you really want to make matters worse, hey, eat like garbage, eat crap, and don't do anything. All right, basically what I'm saying is if you have a poor diet and you're inactive, you're only going to accelerate all of these processes. You've heard the saying, if you don't use it, you lose it, and that's what will happen. All right, I don't know what it is with your section, but I always end up finishing sooner than expected. I'm behind in my other sections, but not with you folks. Okay, is there any questions